On my previous How Powerful Was videos, I've always focused on ancient empires and talked about how they formed, worked, and lasted for however long they did as empires. But this time around, it's a little bit different, since we are talking about a company. But have no illusions, as the Dutch East India Company, or Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, and thus henceforth referred to as the VOC, is often touted as the most valuable company in world history. At its height, worth the equivalent of around $8 trillion US, more than the 20 biggest companies in the world today combined, and completely beating out the British East India Company. So with that in mind, what was the VOC, and just how powerful was it? So first, it might be worth asking what exactly the VOC was. Was it a completely private company? Was it basically just an extension of the Dutch Empire? What exactly was it? Simply put, the VOC was a publicly traded company, focused on trade in and around India and what became known as the Dutch East Indies, known today as the one significant piece of land that the Dutch actually managed to hold onto. It was not just focused on trading and shipping, however, as it also worked in industries such as shipbuilding and even producing some of the goods they traded, making it, in a sense, a kind of proto-conglomeration. The VOC's origin story begins in the late 16th century, a time where the Netherlands was part of Spain, but the Dutch decided they really didn't want that to be a thing, but Spain was all like, yeah, but we do kind of want that to still be a thing. The Dutch had already been shipping in spices from the Indian Ocean, although in practice it was mainly Portugal doing the shipping in and out of Europe, seeing as they were the ones with the colonies and the trading posts in the Indian Ocean. So basically, Dutch traders would ship everything into Lisbon and then redistribute them around Europe. However, in 1580, Spain and Portugal would come under a personal union, and due to that whole war for independence thing that was going on, Lisbon became kind of a less viable trading center for the Dutch. So in order to get the spices that they and their customers wanted oh so badly to both flavor and preserve their food, various Dutch cities started sending out small fleets to the East Indies to establish their own trading posts. Now, back in these times, companies were generally set up to fund a single voyage, and were generally liquidated once these fleets returned, if they returned. The spice trade was an extremely high-risk venture, not just because the ships coming back at all was very much an if, but also because they could come back with really any amount of spices, be they completely empty-handed or bursting at the seams, meaning prices could fluctuate dramatically between shipments. And thus, forming cartels to control the supply once it got to Europe would have often been the safer strategy to help stabilize the prices, something the English had already done in 1600 with the creation of the English East India Company, prompting the Dutch government to unify all these scattered little companies into one united East India Company in 1602. As one united company with the backing of the government, this allowed for hundreds of investors to collectively invest in fleets of well over 500 ships, greatly boosting overall profit and diminishing the effects of potential losses. This effectively created the first ever stock market, where the investors could invest some money now for a proportional share of potentially a lot of money later. Once the VOC had been established, they needed an eastern base of operations. And in 1619, they would forcibly conquer the Javan city of Jayakarta, renaming it Batavia, after the Latin name for the Netherlands, slowly expanding from there, establishing new trading ports throughout Indonesia and India, up into Taiwan, as well as fortresses for ships to recuperate in South Africa, and also crashing into Western Australia a few times along the way. Since the VOC, although still based in Amsterdam, largely operated thousands of kilometers away in a pre-internet and pre-telegraph age, the company was largely allowed to establish its own colonies, wage war and negotiate treaties, and deal justice in a pseudo-governmental fashion on their own, seeing as they and the Dutch government basically had the same interests anyway. You may even recall that the Dutch, and therefore the VOC, were the only foreigners, alongside the Chinese, allowed to trade with Japan in the period in which they were having the country be closed. Though even then, they had to keep most of their business to the small artificial island of Dejima near Nagasaki. The VOC also owned numerous factories far beyond the territories they actually administered, from where they would obtain silks, coffee, porcelain, sugar, precious metals, and several other goods, especially spices, including nutmeg, pepper, mace, and cloves from the Spice Islands, also known as the Maluku Islands, located between Sulawesi and Western New Guinea, and also cinnamon, more pepper, and cardamom from Sri Lanka. They didn't just harvest and take resources though, as they also frequently traded for these goods, with spices to Arabia, silver to India, cloth to Sri Lanka, cloth, silver, and ivory to the East Indies, spices, luxury goods, and cloth to China, and silk, porcelain, spices, and luxury goods to Japan. By the end of the 18th century though, things were not looking all too well for the VOC, as wars with both the British and the French threatened the existence of both the VOC and the Netherlands in general. The Franco-Dutch Wars and the occupation of Amsterdam following the French Revolution prompted the Dutch government to nationalize the VOC in 1796, allowing their lease to finally end in 1799, upon which most of their colonies and trade infrastructure would be handed over to the British. The effects of the VOC, although often brutal to the inhabitants of the regions where they had established their trading ports and factories, completely overhauled how capitalism in general would work in many ways over the coming centuries. The VOC, however, in its effective monopoly over Indian Ocean trade, had also been ardent practitioners of slavery, violence, exploitation, and environmental destruction, namely deforestation. In an effort to stay on top of what was then seen as a zero-sum economy, the largest company in world history has certainly earned itself a complex legacy in the modern world. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and share your thoughts in this video with a comment, follow @Canubis on Twitter and Instagram, or even TikTok if you want cringe that's sometimes educational. If you want to keep getting more of these videos for some reason though, consider supporting the channel on Patreon, and be sure to subscribe to learn something new every Sunday.